G'day you mob, Pete here. Welcome to this episode of Aussie English. Today I have an amazing episode for you guys. I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Shiri Lev-Ari. Now, Dr. Shiri Lev-Ari is a cognitive psychologist studying language and real-life social networks. She has a master's degree in cognitive studies of language from Tel Aviv University, a PhD in psychology at the University of Chicago. She's done postdoctoral research at the University of Chicago and the Laboratory of Cognitive and Psycholinguistic Sciences of Ulm in France. And she's now a lecturer at Royal Holloway at the University of London. So we have an amazing talk today, guys. We chat about her recent publication that looked at how native speakers of a language discriminate against foreign accents and deem them as less trustworthy, and how exposing individuals to foreign languages actually helps increasing this perceived trust. We talk about her work looking at social networks and how they affect language. So this is social networks not as in Facebook or YouTube or anything like that, but your friends, your family, the people that you interact with at work, everything like that when it comes to speaking and using the language. We talk about the importance of diversity and variety of a language's speakers in your network for improving your proficiency in a language. We talk about how slang words develop and spread throughout social networks, how our brains perceive foreign sounds in a language that isn't our native language, and whether you can ever train your brain to be able to hear these subtle differences between similar sounds that are foreign to you. The speed of language evolution in the modern era with our extreme connectivity and the fact that language is now recorded extensively. And we also talk about the effect of colonization on language evolution and how pidgin languages emerge and then rapidly turn into fully fledged Creole languages with the subsequent generations of children who end up speaking this language. Anyway, it's a great episode. I know you're going to enjoy it. Let's get into it. Shiri Lev-Ari, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So I got onto you recently because I was reading The Conversation, which is an online publication that I really, really enjoy. And you had an article in there, Here's Why People Might Discriminate Against Foreign Accents, new research. So guys, obviously go and check out this article, go give it a read and give it a share. But I then obviously wanted to learn more about the author and get you onto the podcast to talk about the findings of this study that you've done. Can you give us a bit of background on you, how you ended up working in the area that you do, doing the research that you do?
Sure. So I study language, but I study language from really a social perspective. So I really care about how the social environment influences how we learn language, how we use language, how the language then also influences our social behavior. And this, I have to say, is not my main line of research. My main line of research actually looks at social networks and how that influences language use. But when I started working on this project, I was just working about interactions between native and non-native speakers and how the expectations we have about non-native speakers influence how we process their language and things like that. And then I started hearing about this research that shows that when something is really hard to process, you believe it less. Mm-hmm. And I was working, like I said, about interactions between native and non-native speakers, and we know that it's harder to process the speech of non-native speakers. So I thought, what would be the implications for interactions between native and non-native speakers? And would that lead people to really believe non-native speaker less? So that was really the start of this project.
Awesome. And did you have like a sort of history here? Because by the sounds of it, I think, and your name, because I've seen it written, I assume you're Israeli and you've learned English as a second language to an incredible proficiency. Did that have anything to do with you being interested in this field of sort of social networks and linguistics as well, having, I assume, passed through that kind of thing in your life too?
I think potentially it was part of what led me to that. I was just interested in language in general. And then I was trying to think about what type of expectations people bring to interactions with other people. And just when I was trying to think for examples of cases where people come with expectations, maybe as a non-native speaker, one of the things I thought, okay, people definitely have expectations about non-native speakers when they interact with them, about the fact that they're going to have lower proficiency, that they're going to be hard to understand, like all these kind of things. So it might have led me in that way. But but my research, it might have led me a little bit, but my research is more general, that I just
Yep.
care about language and society.
Brilliant. So how did you set this study up and answer this question of truthfulness versus, I guess, untruthfulness when it comes to a person's accent and how they're perceived by other people?
Yeah, so actually I should say, so I'll just mention that this is actually based on two studies, one that I've done a while ago, and I should say that this latest study was actually also the master's thesis of Kasia Grabka. So she's the first author. She, like I said, she did a master's with me. So the first study from quite a while ago, actually, we tried to look just at the basic to see, can we find that people believe non-native speakers less? So the way to do that was really just to play people different trivia statements. So some of the trivia statements were true, some were false. So it would be things like ants don't sleep. So the idea is that it was all about like nature, planets, so things like that are not culture specific. And then people just heard, like I said, different statements, and I heard them from, some of them were from native speakers and some of them from non-native speakers. And the non-native speakers had Korean accent, Italian accent, Polish accent, Turkish accent, so a variety of accents, some of them mild, some of them heavy. And yeah, like every person heard both native and non-native, but of course, if someone heard something in a native accent, like ants don't sleep, someone else heard like ants don't sleep in an Italian accent, and someone else heard ants don't sleep in a Korean accent, and so forth. And basically what we found is just that people rated, and basically I should have said, everyone was told two things that are really important, that the goal is to see how good they are at assessing knowledge. So it was really not about, so they thinking that we're trying to see how good they are at really basically knowing if true statements are true or false. And another thing that is really important, we didn't want it to be about prejudice. We really wanted it to be about difficulty of processing. So we told people that these speakers are just reading out sentences that we gave them. So they're not coming up with their own sentences. It's not about whether you believe them or not. They're reading out what we gave them. They don't even know if it's true or not. And to really make it believable, we also made participants record sentences before they started, and we told them we're going to play them for future participants. So they really think it's just people reading aloud. It doesn't matter who the speaker is. And still, people rated the trivia statements as less likely to be true if they heard them with an accent compared to if they heard them in a native speech. So that was the original study. So it really showed that, people believe non-native speakers less. And even when it's not even what the non-native speaker says, they're just messengers. And what we did now in the new study, we also wanted to see if we can reduce the bias. So, but to find like more evidence that it's about difficulty, but also to reduce the bias. So this time we chose just one foreign accent. So this time we did it in the UK. And there are quite a lot of Polish immigrants in the UK. So we decided to focus on Polish accent. So what we did is basically, so first of all, the main task was the same. People heard trivia statements. Some of them were in English, like native English accents. Some of them were Polish accented English, and they just needed to read them. And first of all, I should say everyone on the task, again, believed the statements more when they were native speech compared to Polish accented speech. But we also had a manipulation to see if we can reduce the bias. And the way we did that is before they started doing the task, they just heard different stories. And some of the people heard the stories in just native British accent, and some of them heard it in Polish accent. Now, the thing is that we know that exposure to speech makes it easier to process it. So the more you hear foreign accent, the less it is hard to understand it. So really experience is the best way to get used to the accent. So like I said, people just listened, they listened to stories, answered comprehension question, completely unrelated to the trivia statements, not the same topics, but they just got used to the Polish accent or not if they just heard the native British speakers. And then they did a trivia task. And what we found is that those who previously were exposed to the Polish accented stories showed smaller bias. They still showed bias. Everyone showed bias, regardless of the manipulation, but we managed to reduce it. So they were less biased than those who didn't get any exposure. And I should say, the entire exposure was 10, 15 minutes. So hopefully, if you have more meaningful exposure, maybe it can reduce it more.
Yeah, that's astonishing. And I guess you, for context, you did this with English, obviously being the main language. Would you expect to replicate across effectively every single language on Earth, or would the cultural background of certain languages and where they are geographically and how much influence they have from other cultures influence that? Like if you are, say, I don't know, an Amazonian tribe that has never really come into contact with anyone else besides maybe surrounding tribes, would you expect it to be even greater, the measurement of, I guess, distrust or what they would rank it as being untrue, because, you know, it's the history there?
Yeah, so I focused on discrimination that is not about prejudice. Discrimination that is about prejudice also exists. We know that. Accent is one of the best marker of group memberships. This even goes to the Bible. You can find over there's like this quote about Shibboleth. So basically, according to how you pronounce Shibboleth versus Shibboleth means whether you're a group member or not. Really, there's like there's a segment there that says it's actually quite troubling because they were kind of standing on the border, and if people mispronounced the word, they were killed because that shows they're out-group members. Basically, it's very old accent discrimination. Really not new, really not about globalized word versus not. We actually hope that globalized word would reduce it, but it's very old. But I'm looking really at difficulty of processing. Now, the difficulty of processing is really just about the basic fact of how we process language. So the idea is that people who have, what is foreign accent? Foreign accent is that you pronounce words in ways that are not normative because they're influenced by your other language. And because they're not normative, they don't fit with what people expect when they listen to language. They can also call ambiguity because sometimes the wrong sound is produced. It's always harder. And it's going to be harder regardless of whether you're a small ethnic group in the Amazonas or whether you're in Japan or United States or Australia or India. You're still going to find that people are harder to understand because you're not used to the way they pronounce things. And in addition to the non-use, they're just built-in ambiguities and uncertainties just because, people collapse over sounds that are different to you. So it's just always going to be harder. So to that degree, it should be true everywhere. Now, it's true that in addition to that, there's also prejudice, and the prejudice can either enhance it or reduce it, depending on the culture you live in. But the fact that something is harder to process is always going to be true. I think one potential case, if there are so many immigrants from someplace such that, you already, like I said, exposure helps. You're so used to hearing that accent because it's everywhere, because there's such, intense contact between speakers of the different languages that you're already used to hearing that accent.
What would happen? Would you expect the same thing to happen with, say, really difficult to understand English accents? So despite you obviously being the same native speakers of the same language, you have, say, Glaswegian English, which for the average person who has never had any kind of exposure to it, it will sound like a completely different language and take them quite a while to get used to the dramatic differences in pronunciation. I remember I watched there's a clip about one of the, I think he's from Glasgow and he has that accent, obviously, and he's a politician in the UK and he's trying to ask a question of someone else who's another politician who I think has a background from New Zealand. And he gets up and he's like, I'm going to need you to repeat. And the guy repeats himself. And then again, he's just like, I'm sorry. It must be my background, but I don't understand you. Can you please submit it in writing? And so would you expect the same thing to happen there, despite being the same, speaking the same language as another person? But if you have two different accents and you haven't had exposure to them, you would see exactly the same thing with trust there?
Yeah. So a couple of people thought about it and tried to look at it. One of them looked at it with regional accents in Spain, and one of them actually looked specifically in the UK and they compared foreign accents. So it was Mandarin Chinese and regional accent, which was actually Scottish. I don't remember if it was from Glasgow or where it was, but I remember it was some variety of Scottish accent. And yeah, it was surprising that they didn't find. So for example, the person who looked at both Mandarin Chinese and Scottish one, she did replicate the fact that people believed less something when it was said in Mandarin Chinese accent, but not when it was with a Scottish accent. Wow. I don't remember enough who were the participants, so I don't know how much exposure. She's located in Edinburgh, so I don't know if some of the participants already had some exposure to Scottish accent, but at least, for example, with the Spanish study, they just assumed that maybe the difficulty of processing regional accent, even though it's there, it might not be as big as the difficulty of processing foreign accent. I'm not really sure. Like people did think that it should happen as well.
Yeah.
But so far, we don't have evidence for the same thing with regional accent.
Could it also be that I guess people recognize that accent and they're like, well, they're from my country effectively, right? They're from the United Kingdom. So they give them more trust despite maybe having processing difficulties because they sort of see, in group, despite maybe slightly different accents.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that there's at least less prejudice in terms of actually processing. I don't know, because like I said, my main interest is how people, even people that are not really prejudiced, would discriminate. Just because even if you're not prejudiced, you're going to have a harder time processing, so it should happen regardless. I think part of the reason, but I really don't know, is that foreign accent has several properties that regional accents don't. For example, foreign accent, some people say there's more variability, so it's not as consistent. So it's easier to get used to regional accent because it's very consistent. It just this is how they produce those things. You can get used to it. Whereas with a foreign accent, they might produce it in a whole myriad of different ways that makes it harder.
So you mean like if you were to get
that, it depends, but often.
Sorry, you mean if you were like to get 10 French people who spoke English, they would all potentially have subtleties and differences as opposed to a consistent set of pronunciation rules in English?
Precisely. That's one of the arguments that people make. I don't actually know if it's been tested, but it's been said often. Another thing is that foreign accent often leads to collapsing over several sounds because they don't exist in your language. So, for example, you don't know what the is, so you're just going to say s, but you're also going to say s for s. So you basically, you can't make different vowel contrasts. You just choose one vowel for all these vowels. Usually in regional accent, it depends, but for the most part, you still maintain the contrast. You just produce them differently. So you move all vowels to something different. So again, there's more information there. So it could be that all these things just make it easier to understand regional accent. But like I said, I think more research needs to be done. But so far, people didn't find any evidence for a similar effect with regional accents.
So what are the broader implications of this most recent study that you've done? Should it be something that, if migrants were reading this article and they'd be like, oh my God, discrimination because of foreign accents, do I need to worry about improving my pronunciation or changing things? Is it the kind of thing that they should take that on board? Or is this the kind of thing that maybe governments and native speakers in groups need to at least be aware of and try and implement changes themselves?
Yeah, I would go more with the second one, like rather than the former. And the reason is really that I really think that non-native speakers already have a burden, right? They already need to put so much effort into communicating. I really think that societies should realize that there is discrimination that is built in, that even if they're not prejudiced, of course, there's also, I'm not saying that there's no prejudice in the world, but even regardless of prejudice, there's going to be discrimination because of that. And we need to take that into account and try to find ways to solve it. And the fact that we find that exposure helps, that means we need to think, so it depends on what we're looking at. But for example, if we're looking at people that we know will have to deal with a lot of non-native speakers, maybe we want to have built-in trainings that is about exposure to non-native speakers. Maybe we also want to think about more diverse workplaces where people would interact regularly with non-native speakers. And that actually should help both with prejudice and accent comprehension. So it's like a win-win situation. So I really think this should be the direction of how we make it easier for native speakers to get used to foreign accent and find it easy to understand it.
Have you noticed a change with the BBC by any chance over in the UK with the representation of people or journalists or people that are shown on TV? Because here in Australia, we have the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting, I've forgotten the thing, but I've noticed in probably the last 3 years, they've really gone down the diversity rabbit hole of just trying to make sure that all of the people they interview, the people that they have doing the work, that are doing the journalistic stuff, they're from all sorts of backgrounds. They are migrants. They are people from Ireland or Scotland. And so initially my initial reaction was, oh my God, we're going to lose kind of what the Australian accent is in terms of the ABC and what it should be showing migrants. But then I thought, actually, this is probably better if we think about it from the population of the, born here Australians with the Australian accent, because they're going to be getting so much more exposure to not just different cultures and everything and people of different races, but all these different ways of pronouncing different words and these different accents. So, yeah, I guess my first question is, does that help? And the second one is, have you noticed that locally in Britain?
So, yeah, I do think it should help a lot. I think that that's fabulous that they do that. I mean, it's good for many reasons, from representation, that you just want to see more people like you and what the country is actually like. But also, yeah, it should help with getting used to accent. It's usually better to listen to not just one speaker per accent, but several speakers per accent. That helps you understand better what's just about the speaker versus the accent. But yeah, I think this is the way to go. I can't really say whether that's true over here. I have to say I don't really consume news via television. So
just too busy doing research.
Well, I mean, there are just other outlets to consume news. So.
No, good. I thought I would ask. I would like to also ask you about social networks and their importance for people learning foreign languages, because I was watching, I think, a lecture that you had on YouTube about this, and it seemed really interesting. I think you brought up that the word like great may actually have different meanings depending on the person who's saying it when they're responding to, say, how was the movie? If someone says, oh, yeah, great, or someone says, yeah, great, they may have different meanings, and the importance of having lots and lots and lots of different people so that you can sort of learn that vocabulary and the nuances there. So, yeah, can you tell us a bit about social networks and their importance or their significance when it comes to languages and linguistics?
Yeah, sure. So basically, the idea is that we learn language from our environment, right? Whether it's our first language or our second language, we always learn it from the environment. So it really matters what our environment is. And a lot of my research shows that the more diverse our environment is, the better we are at basically learning language. And that's actually even true for native speakers, not just non-native speakers. And I can really take the example that you said about great, because I think, that's a nice one from a couple of my studies. And the idea over there was to look at how people really differ in how they use language, right? So if you ask someone, oh, how was the film last night? And they say great, for some people, great would be really amazing. I enjoyed it so much. And for some people, great will be kind of like a synonym of, okay, great, it was nice, fine. And it just people differ in how they use that. And what I was interested in those couple of studies was to try to see whether, like I said, in general, I find that having diverse social networks, so having more people, and it's actually also true, although I don't necessarily study that the different people are also going to be different from each other, you're going to get more exposed to how people use language. So you'll be better at understanding it. So you'll understand that, oh, the great of that person, because of their speech style and the other words that they use, probably means really good. But the great of that person, considering the other words that they use in their speech style, probably means not so amazing. And I did a couple of studies to really look at that. So I really this was even native speakers. Of course, this is going to be even more true with non-native speakers. But I was trying to show that even native speakers, if they keep on having a large and diverse social network, they'll be better at language use in their own native language. So the first study was really very simple. I asked people about their social network, and I should say social network are just the people you interact with. They don't have to be your friends. They could be your colleagues, your boss, your clients, your family, just people you regularly interact with. So I asked them, I measured how many people they regularly interact with. And then I showed them restaurant reviews. And what I asked them, and these were restaurant reviews that I collected beforehand, and I just asked them to guess, not guess, but estimate how many stars the person gave the restaurant from 1 to 5.
Very clever.
Yeah. And basically I found that people that had larger social networks were better at doing that.
Wow, really?
So is this a 4 or a 5, or is this a 3 and a 4? So that was really, really nice. Of course, the problem with that is that you don't know the direction of the correlation. So is it a fact that because you have a larger social network, you're also better at understanding people? Or is it that you have a larger social network because you're really good at understanding people?
True.
We don't know which one causes the other one. So I later on also did an actual experiment that tested that. And in that experiment, what I did is initially I, again, collected this time reviews for products, specifically chairs from different people. So I showed them dozens of chairs. They needed to write reviews. And then I did a trick of basically, I wanted to make it about language learning. So I replaced some of the words with novel words. So the person who reads the review doesn't really understand it. It says things like, this chair is Noral. And you don't know that Noral was beforehand horrible, but I changed horrible to Noral. So that way people need to learn the new words, but the new words really function like the old words. So basically I replaced horrible, bad, okay, good, and great. So, the entire spectrum just with new words. And the point is, like I said before, and people use these words differently. And then I had new people come and basically listen to, read actually, the reviews from the previous people. But I made a trick of basically manipulating their social network. So everyone read 40 reviews, so the same amount of exposure to these words. But those 40 reviews came from just 2 reviewers or 8 reviewers. So they either read like a lot from each person or just a little bit, but from many people. And then I tested how well they understood novel reviews that I gave them from other reviewers. And basically I found that if you were exposed to the input from multiple people, you were better. So they had the same amount of exposure, but just because it came from multiple people, they could learn these words better. So even though I did it, so in a sense that what I said, it's true for both native and non-native speech. That means that also as a second language learner, if you keep on interacting just with 1 or 2 people that are native speakers, it's not going to make you as good at learning how to use words compared to if you interact with multiple people.
Is there an upper limit to that? Like if I speak Portuguese with my wife's Brazilian, so I speak Portuguese at home. If I were to get on, say, a language learning website like italki or something, and got 1,000 different tutors and had a single lesson with each of them once, would that be as effective as, say, having or ineffective compared to, say, having 1,000 lessons with 10 tutors or 50 tutors? Like, is there an upper limit where if you were to just, you need time with the same people on a regular basis to be able to absorb, get those repetitions of the use of those words to be able to really ingrain that context? Or is it more just about broad spectrum exposure to as much as possible?
Yeah, I would assume that, I guess now people understand the concept better, so logarithmic rather than linear. So I do think that, the difference between 2 and 1 is very big. The difference between 3 and 2 is still big, but not as big as 2 and 1. I would say, I didn't necessarily test that, but that would be my hypothesis.
Yeah.
But 10 is much better than 1, but the difference between 20 is still better than 10, but the increase is not as big as 10 to 1. And yeah, it could be that 100 versus 110, probably going to make small difference. 200 might still be better than 100, but you'll need it, the addition of every speaker becomes smaller the more speakers you already interact with. Because the idea is that if you want to be exposed to multiple ways of using language, at some point, if you have a large enough network, you kind of sampled all the different ways that people use language. So just encountering a few more people, they're still going to use the language, probably people you already encountered. So it might not be as useful to meet more and more.
So what are the sort of roles of social networks too for developing new words, right? I think I was watching you and you were talking a little bit about that in this lecture, and I was thinking Australian English is known as probably the dialect of English that has the largest amount of slang that we make up. So we have something like 5,000 diminutive slang words that we use, and I think the equivalent, for other dialects is usually around 1,000, maybe 2,000. We have some ridiculous amount. So a good example of a word that I think escaped Australia and went wide was selfie, right? So we came up with that, I guess, someone somewhere. So what is the role of social networks, and how do these words kind of end up developing and then escaping? Is there something too that allows certain words to escape and just become widespread and accepted by other people? Or yeah.
Yeah, there is actually some research on that. Not so much mine, but there is the idea of, in general, if you look at community size, then first of all, the more people there are, the more words that they'll be invented. It doesn't mean that all of them will spread, but more people will invent words. And there is something that shows, I'm trying to remember the details of that study. I feel bad that I'm not citing the person who found it. But the idea was that in general, I do think that I found that in larger communities, the words are more maintained and you don't lose words as much. So in smaller communities, words are much more likely to go away. And I don't want to say too much. I don't remember that well. But the idea is that, yes, things like the structure of the network. So it's both going to be how big it is. It's going to be how connected it is. Because, different communities can be very interconnected, where all your friends also talk to each other and their friends' friends talk to each other. Or it can be quite sparse, that you have friends that don't know at all and don't interact with your other friends and so forth. So all these things really influence both how information spread, whether it can be maintained, whether it can reach the entire community or go away. So all these things matter, but I don't remember enough the details to go into that.
No, that's all good. I'm just curious. These are sort of just questions that come to mind. And I'm always really fascinated with, Australian English, obviously, and why it has so much more slang than other dialects. And I think a big part of it is that our culture is it's kind of really tied in with our culture to be sort of inventive with language. And I think that's why we create these words and end up maintaining them and using them a lot more. Whereas I think if you were to go to, say, Great Britain, from again, the limited understanding that I have as someone who's like genetically British but has never been there, I feel like there would probably be the opposite kind of pull for, received pronunciation speakers, where they would probably be like, don't use slang, stay away from it a little bit and maintain that certain culture or the way that you appear to other people. But it's always something interesting that I wonder about. Do you think that social media has had a massive effect on those sorts of things too, where it allows words to be created and spread rapidly, but it potentially can also just lead to them dying out because there's so much new uptake, that can just spread around the globe overnight?
Yeah, it is true. Things now, I think that a lot of language change can happen much more quickly, because information, like words, really, and people also change the grammar all the time, and all these things really change very quickly. Will it also lead to dying more quickly? That's an interesting question. I really don't know. I think that it depends. It depends whether some of the things that you're inventing are not just replacing the previous ones, right? They're adding more shades of meaning. And if they're not replacing the other ones, then there's no reason for the other ones to go away. You're just going to have a larger and larger vocabulary. But of course, at some point, you can't maintain all of it. But potentially, yes. I mean, I definitely think it accelerates language change. I don't know. I think it's a really interesting question to ask whether it would also lead to words dying more quickly. I'm not sure, because you can say that because now there's written evidence for it everywhere. It's there, you can see it and encounter it. Whereas, speech is ephemeral, you lose it. Whereas over here, you can also find a tweet from 2 years ago. So I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. I don't know.
What would you expect to with, say, language evolution with the internet and with the fact that we can just save everything now? Because I imagine that language, again, from someone who's not a linguist, I imagine that language was evolving so much more rapidly when you were, say, an isolated group in the Amazon. Even today, those groups probably have language, I would imagine, that changes really quickly because it's not written down. And so, you would imagine what you pass on is liable to just have new words, and then your kids make new words. It's not like you get to keep reading literature that was written down decades or 100 years ago and be like, these are the words that we use. Here's the dictionary, and there's no deviating from this. We can add to it, but we don't really change any of it and say this no longer means this. So do you think with the internet and with social media and the fact that we can save everything today, if you were to fast forward, say, 200, 300, even 1,000 or 2,000 years, you would be like, the pronunciation may differ, but it's going to be recognizable. English writing isn't going to suddenly be character-based like Chinese.
So I do think, I don't know if it's the internet, I definitely think that starting to write down things probably slowed language evolution. Yes, for precisely the reasons that you're saying. Now we know this is the word. This is this is sort of how it's written. So I definitely agree that probably the invention of writing really slowed down. Obviously, we cannot really since language was before, we cannot study how quickly language changed before writing was invented because we don't have any access to that.
Yeah.
But I think that's true. But I think, sorry, you had another point that I forgot that I wanted to answer to.
About pronunciation changing, or?
Yes. So that's actually, I'm not sure. So one thing that is interesting is that small groups, what I find in my studies, so I should actually say that how I conduct some of my studies of language evolution. So I basically get people to create language in the lab. So I really show them novel things that they've never seen, and they need to interact about them with new people, but are not allowed to use any language they know. They create gibberish words, and as they create gibberish words and they interact in rounds for several hours, they actually create a language. And when I say they create a language, I really mean that, they start, first of all, having a vocabulary that everyone agrees on, but they also start creating grammar and morphology. They really start creating a language out of talking in gibberish. But I manipulate the type of social structure that I have. So sometimes I have very small groups, sometimes I have large groups. I manipulate how interconnected they are. And I found that actually small groups are much more likely to do really weird things. Yeah. So in a sense, all large groups sort of look the same. If you get a large enough group, they'll always, by the end, reach sort of the same type of complex grammar, the same type, they're going to be very similar to each other. It's kind of like the law of big numbers. You go into something that is easy for everyone and fits there, everyone. But with small groups, you can be really influenced by one weird invention of one person and everyone goes with it. And because it's a small group, they can all accommodate to each other.
That's so interesting, because that's like evolution, right? If you have a small population, mutations can arise and then they diverge rapidly. Whereas if you have a really large population, it happens a lot more slowly and you're not going to have some.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. So yes, so in that case, I don't know, but pronunciation can go in multiple ways just because, like I said, in small groups, and especially if we tend to think that society now lives in larger groups compared to in earlier times,
then,
I would actually assume a lot of variability back there with each group going in some weird direction and us and now, because language is used by larger groups for the most part, they converge more, but yeah, like I said, there's a lot of speculation there, but definitely we see in all the experiments that really small groups can end up with languages very different from each other in for good or bad, or just very different.
Yeah, I always wonder. I think I was learning about Australian English and the pronunciation changes since being developed, because we had this really weird. The reason we have this, the accent that we do to some extent is because we had all of these convicts come over in the late 1700s, right, when we were colonized, and we had a bunch of people from London, but then the convicts tended to be people from, the lower socioeconomic parts of society, from Scotland, from Ireland, and you had them all in a very isolated place with only maybe 1,000 to 2,000 people, and then their children that were born in the colony were the ones who had their own accent. So they noticed within the first generation, they were like, shit, all these kids are developing their own pronunciation as opposed to copying their parents. They're like, we are much more influenced by our peers than we are by our parents. And so that was how we ended up with this rapid change in pronunciation from British English.
I didn't know that about the history, but that's really interesting and it makes sense. So I would say it's not so much probably that they ignored their parents' pronunciation, but they probably tried to also find some way that also, I wouldn't say averages across them, but takes over not only from your own parents' accents, but the other accents. That's something that makes sense. So in general, this is something that I don't know if you want me to talk about it, but the whole idea of how language evolves. So there's the idea how you move from kind of a pidgin to a Creole. So pidgin is when you start having two groups of speakers of different languages start interacting. So for example, you might find it in trade relations, in colonialism. So really intense interaction by people who don't speak the same language.
Well, a good example, I think, would be the pidgin that's spoken in Papua New Guinea, right? Because they'll have all their native languages, but then they have the mixed with English, really stripped back with grammar, and it's very specific kind of like interaction-based language that's used.
I don't know enough about the situation in Papua New Guinea, but that sounds very much like the way it is. As you said, it tends to have, not much grammar, and it's communicative, but it's not fully grammatical, and it's not the way we usually languages as they usually are. But what happens once you usually start have children? The children need to acquire their language. And what the children do, they actually create a grammar. And it's not like they sit down and say, I'm going to create a grammar, but they need to find some structure to something. So they do take from their parents, but they have to do more than that. And then actually you see that with each generation, you have more grammar that basically the new learners create. And it's called a Creole. So actual, languages that do look just like other languages in terms of having more grammatical structure. And so that happens often. You can find it in many places, a lot in Africa because of colonialism, or in the
Caribbean, right?
Caribbean, yes. So it's very common. Some people say that that's how Swahili started, Arab traders and Bantu languages. So that's how you got created Swahili. But they become real languages, but by the learners. It's the infants that need to learn it. The parents don't really have such a structured language, and they create it. And it could happen with accent as well, because you need to find something that allows you to bridge all of that.
Do you have children, if I can ask?
No, I don't.
Because I was going to ask if you'd taught them, if you'd had them both Israeli and English. I've got young children. One is 2.5, and he speaks both Portuguese and English, but he mixes them. And it's really interesting to see him create new words for stuff that he doesn't know. So a good example is like in Portuguese, pássaro is bird, right? And so we were trying to teach him these words, there's a bird. And I had no idea how much we'd be talking about freaking birds to kids, but you see them everywhere. And so the kids are always like, what's that? What's that? But he just came up with his own, that's caca. That's caca. Like there's a caca there. And so even now, I refer to birds quite often with him as, oh, look, caca, like there's a caca. Do children, are they the ones that kind of are the evolutionary pump when it comes to language and language evolution? Is that where all the change tends to happen? If you were to look at the demographics of a population that speak a certain language, would you imagine that it's the young children or the adolescents that are the ones creating that diversity that leads to languages changing?
Yeah, so actually for many, many decades, that's what people in linguistics and psychology thought. So they thought that it's really the children who changed the language. And like I said, there is quite a lot of evidence to that if you think about things like Creole or the example that you just gave with the accents in Australia. But I think that actually over the last few decades, people understood that it's actually not just children. So adolescents have a big part, but even adults. If I could find some recording of you from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you'll probably notice that you don't actually quite talk the same way.
Yeah, I was wondering that.
There's like this really, really nice study by Jonathan Harrington. And what he did is he looked at the Christmas announcements, like the Christmas speech that the Queen makes every year.
Yeah.
And he tracked it for many years. They basically found that her pronunciation changed over the years. So basically the Queen no longer actually speaks the Queen's English.
I was wondering that. I've got grandparents who are in their 90s, and I always think, did they speak so kind of, they almost speak like received pronunciation Queen's English kind of English. And I always wondered, what did they sound like as teenagers? Did they really sound like this? And I guess the best thing about being a podcaster, if I can maintain this until I'm 90, there'll be like a almost daily, series to look at and be like, how much have I actually changed? I imagine too, it's vocab too, and certain phrases and expressions. And I've noticed that they'll come and go. I'll be having conversations with someone and they'll use something, and something subconsciously is like, oh, that's really good. And then all of a sudden I'm saying ostensibly all the time, So it is really funny how that obviously that it just evolves and changes over time throughout your life, right?
I think that the best way to see it, or at least in my experience, if you sometimes meet people who were born in your country but left, I don't know, some time ago.
Yeah.
So you suddenly talk to them, and it's not just their slang. Slang is part of it, but even outside it, they use like expressions that's like, yeah, I guess we used it in the 80s. Or like, things that you no longer say, but they still say, because it's really just the way you phrase things really changes all the time. So I guess what I'm saying is that we all change language, both adults and children, because we don't keep the same way of talking throughout our lives.
An amazing example of that for you to potentially go down the rabbit hole of is Australia and the Italian migrants that came in, I think about the 50s and the 60s to Melbourne. And there's a street that we have in Melbourne called Lygon Street, which has all of these Italian restaurants and pubs and cafes and everything on it that have been there for that long. And it's really funny. You'll talk to them and they're like, we're the authentic Italians, with the authentic food and the way that we speak. And I'll meet Italians who've come yesterday to Australia and they'll be like, these guys are out of a time capsule, man. You'll talk to them and it's like, I'm talking to my grandfather, but their kids have learnt that Italian. And so it's this really funny thing where it's almost like they've been frozen in time and taken away. And then they don't go back to Italy often, they'll just grow up in Australia, but they speak Italian. And so you have this weird thing of when they interact with Italians, they're like, both of them think each other is weird,
I would just say that probably the Italian speakers on the street also don't quite speak the way they actually talked back then. So they also changed. It just didn't change in the same direction as the people in Italy. They just changed on their own trajectory.
Sort of finishing up, because I know I've kept you quite a while, what's the sort of history with Hebrew and Israel? Because you obviously had a lot of Jewish people from all over Europe and the continent, they're coming into a single area. Did you have a really interesting sort of melting pot of accents and dialects when that happened? And has that led to a sort of really, really diverse language that you now have, or is it more sort of homogenized?
In terms of accent, you mean?
Yeah, and vocab and everything, I guess, too, because I imagine that was really different depending on where you were from originally.
Yeah, although I would say that usually people who came to Israel didn't speak Hebrew, so they learned Hebrew.
Oh, okay. Really?
So,
sorry, forgive my ignorance. Forgive my ignorance.
No, yeah, it's just that Hebrew was not used as a spoken language. Sometimes it was only used like liturgically, like, people used it when praying, but that was about the only context that people used it outside of Israel. And I'm not even sure that everyone actually prayed in Hebrew rather than in translation, but I'm not sure about that. But really, they couldn't speak like Hebrew.
Wow.
Only when they came to Israel, they learned Hebrew. So in that sense, they learned the same version, which doesn't mean, and I think there's quite less variation in Israel compared to other countries. I think potentially because it's small, potentially because we actually move a lot. I think it's quite uncommon to find someone who grew up and spent their entire life in the same place. You move an hour away, but an hour away in Israel is like half of the country away. So like in that sense, I think we don't have as much geographical variation. We do have socioeconomic variation that does exist, but that, that always, so that kind of thing does exist. And tiny bit of ethnic variation as well, just because, so it's not so much that people learn different versions of Hebrew, but if you learn Hebrew, and beforehand, just like non-native speakers, like we said, when they learn a new language, they bring their knowledge of the previous language into the new language. So if you previously spoke Arabic, you're going to sound different than if you previously spoke Russian or Polish. So in that sense, there's some variation, but it's also, unclear to what degree it's also maintained in coming generations. Some markers completely, like that there were ethnic markers, seem to disappear for the most part. But we have a lot of socioeconomic variation, but not so much. But that's less about, like I said, because they only learn Hebrew when they come to Israel.
Yeah. It's interesting. Australia's kind of the same. If you were to come to Australia and drive around, you wouldn't really see geographical differences in terms of pronunciation. There's a few little things like slightly different. Someone from Queensland might say school instead of school. So there's that kind of thing, but it's much more related to whether you're in the city or you're in rural environments where you might have a broader sort of more nasally and more diphthongs kind of accent. And so, but we compare that to Britain, and I've met people, there's a guy that I met from Yorkshire in Australia, and he was like, yeah, for the first 40 years of my life, I didn't go more than 30 kilometers from where I grew up. And I was just like, Like, that's just so foreign to me. It blew my mind. Anyway, last question is, based on your research, what sort of advice would you have for people coming to Australia as, migrants that are learning English as a foreign language? Based on your sort of knowledge about social networks, how can they best kind of use that in order to improve their language, or at least speed up the process of learning English? I ask because I know a lot of people who come here and then end up living and interacting with people from their home country. And I'm always like, try and limit that anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would say limit that, but just make sure that you also have interactions with native speakers. I think there is a lot of support you can get from interacting with people, who are also migrants and experience the same thing. But yeah, I think you just want to have a diverse network. So make sure that you interact with several different types of people who are native speakers. So both like different people, but also preferably of different ages, different socioeconomic background. The more you can get diversity in your input, the more you can really get used to being able to understand new speakers and get a better idea of, what the English in the new place is. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Would it also be with foreign accents as well? Does that also have an important place?
Yeah, do you mean in order to, if you want to get used to also the foreign accent, then yes, interact with a lot of foreign speakers of that accent and you'll become better at it. So there is a lot of literature that really shows that the more people you interact with, the better you get idea of that accent.
Brilliant. Well, Shiri, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find out more about you and your work and what you do?
Yeah, so I have a website, but I don't know. I guess if you Google my name and social networks, I'm going to assume that that's going to come up. So yeah.
It does. It's the first thing to come up.
Okay, good. So so all my publications are over there, available for free for anyone to read. And feel free to contact me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me. Bye.